Hi there, Rachel Sherman here, and in this video we're going to look at the fourth part of the project now that we've finished taking our random samples. The process I'm going to teach you about here is applying the margin of error functions to create confidence intervals for your work. And you'll notice that this section, similar to the organized data and raw data, has requirements where you're expected to fill in and kind of pick and choose what would be, if you had to select one, the best choice for your data itself and which you feel is most appropriate. And you would be specific. So for example, are there outliers, no outliers, so on and so forth. So for this, I'm going to teach you how to apply the functions for confidence intervals, and know that you're going to use the same rules for your sample of 30 like we have over here, but so we can keep it all on one page, I'm going to start with our samples of 5. So before you go any further, go ahead and fill in your mean and standard deviation and coefficient of variation using the functions that we learned about in the first video. I'm going to pause for a moment and go ahead and fill all of those in for our 3 samples. Alright, so interestingly enough, if you notice here, all of our means are actually very close with our samples of 5, which is not always going to be the case. You'll notice, however, that the standard deviations are quite a bit different if you look at sample 1 versus samples 2 and 3, where they are quite close together. So it's almost as if sample 1 is suggesting that the data is more consistent than it actually is. So now that you've gone through that, you might even be able to comment on how this compares to the population data as a whole. Now, moving forward and learning how to apply the confidence interval functions, it's actually very straightforward. Just like most of what you've seen in Excel up to this point, you'll know that Excel is pretty intuitive. My favorite phrase is, Excel is like a puppy dog. It really only wants to make you happy. So if you want to do something with confidence, the formula probably has something to do with confidence. So you're going to type equals, and if you start typing in the word confidence, the confidence t function, in this case we're using t because we're dealing with the sample, the confidence functions are going to provide you the margin of error. So this specifically gives you the margin of error. It does not give you the full interval. Once you find the margin of error, then you can calculate your upper and lower bounds. So I'm going to go ahead and use confidence t. Now, if you want to do this at 95%, then you have to tell it what alpha is. Remember that alpha is the complement of whatever that amount is. So alpha would be 0.05. And if you decided to do 99% instead, that's fine. Just make sure you change that number to 99 instead of 95. Your standard deviation comes next, so I'm going to go ahead and just click on my standard deviation. And for this example, it's a size of 5. When you're on the other slide for sample of 30, you would fill in a 30 at the end there. So this means that we have a margin of error of 2.7 and some change. The lower bound and upper bound, as you might be aware of from the fancy functions, right, when you're doing this by hand, is your lower and upper bound are always the mean minus and plus the standard, the margin of error. So for my lower bound, I'm going to take my mean and subtract the margin of error. And for my upper bound, I'm going to take the mean and add my margin of error to it. So we can be 95% confident that the population mean amount of physical inactivity in adults per 100 in the U.S. is somewhere between 19.7 and 25.1 or 25.2 there. Now what does this tell us? Remember that theoretically, if we were relying strictly on sample data, we're trying to see, can this sample of 5 states estimate the true population amount? It may seem a little confusing because yes, of course we do have population data because that's how we structured this assignment. But the idea behind this is learning how could you, if you had to use a sample, how could you apply a confidence interval to estimate the population data instead? So let's go through that one more time. We're going to use the confidence t function. Alpha is still 0.05. And then this time we're using the other standard deviation with a size of 5. And just like you did before, you're going to take your mean minus the margin of error, and then the mean plus your margin of error. And you'll notice that there is a massive difference in that margin of error. For our sample with a standard deviation that was a bit higher, it's definitely increased the size of the margin of error. To finish out this portion of the project, you're going to go ahead and use the margin of error formula, lower bound, upper bound, for the last one of your sample of 5, and then also repeat that process for your samples of 30. In the next video, we're going to learn how to apply hypothesis testing techniques to finish up the last piece of the Excel project requirements. Thank you for watching.